Weak connectivity, trade infrastructure and knowledge infrastructure have proven to be the main shortcomings in Africa. Justin Jacobs, the RICC Director at Euler Hermes, joins us now to discuss the country's ability to provide the necessary environment for business to succeed in an increasingly digitized global economy. Justin, busy day, I know. Good to have you in the studio. Just give me a sense of digitization and the methodology used to quantify the rate of digitization here.
Okay, good morning, Arnold. Thanks for having me on the show. There's a difference between the digitization and digitalization. If I can just give you an example, many companies think that by moving from analog to digital, that is actually digitalization, and it's not. Because just changing the method of putting a letter through a fax machine through to your email, that is not really digitalization. Digitalization is basically when companies can transform the business model in that what they do is, through digitalization, add value products or digital value products and services to the market. So there's a slight difference to the two concepts.
Right. Now, your report does have some very fascinating findings. Okay. One thing that really strikes me is that balance between digitization or digitalization and hardly any investment in the space. Now, is this a case of causality or correlation?
It is more causality because what we're finding is that with digitalization, there's a huge difference. There's a huge gap, especially in the South African or in the African market, more specifically on the African continent. What we're finding is that in our studies is that there's a lot of weakness in terms of infrastructure, weakness in terms of connectivity, in terms of costs, the high levels of costs, in terms of internet usage and connectivity. And I think this is a huge challenge for the whole African market. In terms of South Africa itself, I think they're leading. Of course, South Africa leads the pack in terms of digitalization. But what I'm finding is that there's not a lot of collaboration between African countries.
And this is one thing that's actually very fascinating, because your research does point to Kenya investing more in infrastructure. On the other hand, South Africa being stellar on digital technology. Now, is there a shortcut here to achieve digitization as a whole?
Look, I mean, one example that I've seen specifically in Kenya, for instance, they've already taken some shortcuts. For instance, you find the infrastructure is sometimes very weak in terms of, if you just look at robots, there's not many robots that are operational. But then you get into any mini taxi, and every mini taxi has a Wi-Fi facility. So you can even pay your fees through M-Pesa.
Right.
So there are some disparities in terms of that.
Let's talk about regulation, because we did have the CEO of Safaricom last year, and this was a time when the regulator was making it very clear that M-Pesa need to be separated from Safaricom.
That's
and
right.
He said something very fascinating, saying that we are being punished for being successful. Yes. Now, is there such a thing as regulation actually hurting many of the big boys actually who are trying to hasten the process of digitization on the continent?
I think the problem with regulation, or like something with M-Pesa, is that we haven't clearly defined as Africans, as African governments and as African players. We haven't clearly defined the regulation around digitalized products and services. And I think that's where we need to start. We need to clearly define that. We need to clearly clarify that for companies for those services. The second thing is the barriers in terms of digitalization. We need to remove those barriers. And until we remove those barriers, a lot of these companies that are thriving or trying to thrive in being digital is going to struggle.
Justin, the other thing that you actually highlight here is human capital and the need to actually invest in STEMs. Now, this is very striking because there's another report that came out just the other day showing that in South Africa, 1 out of 3 STEM graduates actually is the one who's getting a job. The other 2 out of 3 are not getting jobs.
Yes.
Isn't this a mismatch per se? I want to sit on the fence on this one.
Yeah, look, especially in South Africa, it is problematic because I think what I find missing is that we're not creating an environment. We're not doing enough to create an environment to boost digitalization. So you're finding that there's very few companies that are successful. I mean, you find that generally banks are more successful than the normal average South African company. I think if we can move our mindset and encourage a culture of digitalization, looking for solutions in through digitalization instead of maybe focusing on other aspects in terms of education. And like you say with STEM, for instance, I mean, just looking at mathematics, it is problematic. So education, critical for digitalization to thrive.
Finally, Justin, you do definitely mention Internet of Things, smart logistics, smart technologies here.
Yeah.
But this, for me, is always a problem because investing in some of these things is, I would say, putting the carriage before the horse. Why? Because Internet penetration across the continent is barely 35%. Shouldn't we be concentrating on hastening that process of having more penetration of the Internet on the continent?
You know, it starts with energy. I think just for digitalization to work on the continent, we need to have a constant supply of energy. We need to have a proper supply of energy. And you're right. What I'm finding is that with digitalization, it's very fragmented. So for instance, we've done well in the motor sector, in the motor industry. But what I'm finding is we're not learning from those wins or those small wins, and we're not passing it on to other sectors where we could derive quite a bit of dividends. And of course, we're not sharing it with other countries, which is another problem on the African continent. Because remember, we're all different economies.
Do you get the sense that with a free trade area being signed and more integration across the continent, this is the answer to that?
Yeah, for me, governments need to talk to each other. We don't necessarily need to compete against each other. I'm not saying entrepreneurship is wrong, but what I'm saying is, as countries on the African continent, we could quite easily make use of each other's strengths and weaknesses to get digitalization off the ground.